Just now starting to learn the sentence for former Chicago Alderman Ed Burke. He, of course, the city's longest serving alderman. He was convicted back in December on federal bribery and attempted extortion charges.
And prosecutors were asking for 10 years in prison, while Burke's attorneys were asking for home confinement or probation. Do we have Sarah Schulte live? Yeah, we want to go live to Sarah Schulte to start some of our coverage with the latest now. Sarah, what do you know?
Hey, Rob, just what you mentioned. Judge Virginia Kendall just handed down her sentence. It's 2 years plus a $2 million fine, much less than the 10 years that prosecutors originally asked for. Also less, about 4 years less than the sentencing guidelines. Now, sentencing guidelines are not mandatory, so the judge has the discretion to do what she wants. Now, when she did talk, she spoke for quite a bit before she did hand down her sentence. She seemed to be very taken by the hundreds of letters that the defense handed in to her. Letters from a former U.S. attorney, letters from a former chief judge, 2 former police chiefs, also dozens of just ordinary citizens who Burke had helped throughout the career. So that did seem to really have an impact on when she handed down the sentence. Of course, she says, though, the acts that he was convicted of, attempted extortion, racketeering, and bribery from 2016 to 18 did not wipe out all those good deeds he did, but she certainly was taken by that, given the fact that originally prosecutors wanted 10 years and she sentenced him to 2 years, but of course a $2 million fine. Few things that she did say, I think in all these public corruption cases, all judges need to address public corruption. She says we have to look beyond the act. It's an impact on democracy. When the citizens lose faith, they begin to take the law into their own hands, and that begins the whittling away of the rule of law. If the citizens think of that as the Chicago way, then that's when we're eroding the rule of law. Now, one thing that we do know, right before she did hand down her sentence, Ed Burke did address the court. He spoke very, very briefly. He did not offer any type of remorse at all, but he did say, I've been blessed to have a wonderful family and friends, blessed to have a great career. To blame this, it's on me and me alone. I regret the pain to my family and friends. I ask for mercy, and I'd like to spend as much time as God will give me on this earth with my wife, children, and grandchildren. Again, it was a very, very quick thing. His attorneys are likely to appeal this case, so he's probably not going to come right out and say, express remorse or express guilt. But of course, he did talk about the fact that, that if there's any blame, it's on me, and I'm sorry that the pain that I caused. So that is the very latest. Of course, this is the longest serving alderman in city council, 54 years. One of the probably most powerful aldermen that we've ever seen in the history of Chicago was just handed a sentence of 2 years in a federal prison. Back to you guys.
Sarah Schulte with some firsthand accounting on what happened in that courtroom. Our Craig Wall also has been there. We'll get some more details from him as the afternoon progresses. Want to bring in our political correspondent, our political analyst, Laura Washington, who has covered Chicago politics for many, many years. That is a compliment, Laura, because you know a lot of people and you've seen a lot of things come and go.
Yeah,
I have indeed.
And what a moment this is, right? We knew that he was convicted and we were waiting for sentencing. First of all, Laura, your reaction to the 2-year sentence?
Well, it was definitely milder than I think many people expected, given the extent of the crimes, given the fact that the prosecutors were asking for much more time, and given the fact that he is such a powerful and prominent now convicted criminal. I'm sure his family is thrilled and relieved, but he will be spending 2 years in prison, and for an 80-year-old man, that's quite a burden to carry forward.
Some of his supporters had called it essentially, if the 10 years from the prosecution's recommendation was fulfilled, a death sentence for a man who's 80 years old. The judge obviously thought some incarceration, Laura, was necessary. How do you think the rest of the current politicians, because this was a complicated case with some who cooperated with the government, does this potentially bring an end to corruption in Chicago and Illinois politics, or at least start that process?
Well, hopefully, let's say it will start the process. We have seen more than 30 aldermen convicted of crimes over the last several decades. So clearly, all of those previous convictions did not deter this activity. Some of those aldermen were convicted just within the last several years. But because he was so powerful, because he was at the top of the political heap, because he was such a symbol of Chicago power, of the Democratic Party machine, maybe at least it will send a message that the kinds of activities that the Chicago machine has engaged in for decades, the using their clout and their power to their own personal benefit, maybe that era is finally going to end, and maybe at least it will send the message that it's time for it to end.
And Laura, I just want to get your take. As Rob mentioned, you've been covering Chicago politics for quite some time. I mean, think about this moment. The longest serving Chicago alderman, one of the most powerful, as you mentioned, at the top of that heap in terms of political power and structure here in Chicago, and today getting sentenced to federal prison.
Well, it sends a message certainly that no one is above the law, no matter how powerful or how high you climb, that you are going to be brought to judgment if you do commit crimes. The federal government has a lot of power. They have a lot of resources at their disposal. So no matter how much power you have, Ed Burke had millions of dollars at his own disposal to pay defense attorneys to defend himself. But in the end, he was brought down.
Laura, I think a lot of young Chicagoans here, some of us veteran reporters here at Channel 7, and you obviously who have written about them for so long, they hear the machine and they hear about years past. But can you just briefly tell people who may have heard Ed Burke's name but not quite understand who Ed Burke was in City Council?
And just how powerful he was.
Right.
Yeah.
He had a 54-year career in City Council, beginning with his father, who was a ward boss, who was an alderman. When his father passed away, Ed Burke took over power in the 14th Ward and built it from there. He was the head of the Finance Committee at City Council, which meant he oversaw everything related to finance, budget, the money that flowed through City Council. He oversaw judicial appointments. He was the party's essentially ad hoc chairman in terms of keeping the door open or closed to people who wanted to become judges. He oversaw so much of what went on in the City Council. And I think one of the things that came out in the trial and came out in his defense was all the favors and all the clout that he had dispensed through that period of time, and how that made him even more influential. And then finally, he was a very powerful zoning attorney, which meant that he had a lot to say about zoning laws, about who could benefit from zoning laws and who might be hurt by the zoning laws. He represented Donald J. Trump in terms of his own business dealings at Trump Tower. So there's no doubt that he was the most powerful alderman probably ever to sit in the City Council.
Wow, 54 years too.
Absolutely.
It's an incredible number when you think about it.
We should also mention, because he has been seen going into court this morning with his wife, Ann Burke, who was a Supreme Court justice here for the Illinois Supreme Court, and in fact spent, 2 or 3 years as the Chief Justice on that court. And she wrote a very emotional letter to the judge in this case as well prior to sentencing.
Correct. And of course, she would not have reached those heights on the Supreme Court, no doubt, without Ed Burke's blessing, without his support. One of the things that came out in the testimony was that he encouraged her to go to law school. He encouraged her career. And I think that that's the human side of Ed Burke. That shows how important family was to him and how important community was to him. And I think all of that testimony that came out in his defense at the end, it did have some impact on that sentence. And I think the sentence was lower than it would have been because of all the community service he had done over 54 years.
She was never accused of any wrongdoing throughout all of this. You mentioned some of the zoning. There was some audio and videotapes that really broke down the granular details of how much impact he had on construction in certain places, particularly his ward and others. The $2 million, we have that below you on our breaking news banner, a $2 million fine. That's something to sneeze at. That is a lot of money.
That's a huge amount of money, and probably one of the highest fines. Yeah. Certainly, that's been levied against a city council member or a local public official. But there was a lot of money involved, and there were some arguments and discussion earlier today during the sentencing hearing about the financial impact. His own attorney says that he never benefited benefited financially from it, from any of the things that he did, but there was a large financial impact, and I think that $2 million is what at least the judge believes it should be the price to pay for that financial impact on his crimes.
Okay, well, Laura, stay with us. Always appreciate your insight, but we're going to hop back on to court right now. Sarah Schulte there standing by, and now Craig Wall, our political reporter, also there. You guys take it away.
Just coming down from the courtroom, just to add a little bit of color to what you might have already said, and that is the fact that when the verdict came down, Ed Burke, as he has been really through much of this day, stoic. Not much of an expression at all in his face, but sitting behind him, his wife Ann, she looked like she was tearing up. I don't think she actually cried, but you could see she was very emotional. 2 years, $2 million fine. The defense team did request that he be sent to the federal prison camp in Oxford, Wisconsin, up north of the Wisconsin Dells, and his report date is in September. I have to look back at the date here in a sec, but afterwards he was shaking hands, hugging his wife. She came up to him, gave him a big hug. They hugged for several seconds. She kissed him on the cheek. Touching moment when you saw that there. He then shook hands with his attorneys, and then other people came up, and but then I saw him smiling as I was walking out. He was almost like, okay.
Maybe he was relieved. I mean, remember the prosecutors asked for 10 years. The sentencing guidelines, which I've mentioned before, which aren't mandatory, called for 6 to 8. So maybe he looked at this. I mean, look, Ed Burke is an extremely smart guy. He was extremely attentive towards this entire day, paying very close attention. He's a lawyer. He probably, and certainly knows that, look, in this courtroom, about 11 years ago, Judge Zagel sentenced Rod Blagojevich to 14 years to give everybody a message. So, you know, I think maybe Alderman Burke, former Alderman Burke, knew that it could have been a lot worse than 2 years.
Yeah, the interesting thing in just listening to Judge Virginia Kendall talking about it, she goes, I don't think that there is any personal deterrence that can come out of this case. She goes, I don't think in your 81st year you're going to go out and commit any other crimes. Probably a good evaluation at this point. And she also talked about how in many of the other racketeering-related cases, the sentences have been far less than prosecutors are asking, and she obviously showed some mercy and compassion that defense was asking for.
She is a senior jurist, and she is known in this building to be extremely fair. And that's, you know, her reputation here. So.
And Ed Burke, I think, probably thinks she was pretty fair compared to what she could have given him. Back to you guys.
Craig and Sarah, you can hear us
in the studio.
Oh yes, thank you. Okay, Craig, I wanted to ask real quick for you. You listened to a lot of testimony today from various witnesses. Did any particularly stick out to you? And then also wanted to ask you about Ed Burke. Also addressed the court, right?
Yeah, it was interesting. The witnesses that testified for the defense were really trying to mitigate what he did and bring it down into context.
Right. Prior to the actual sentencing, there was actually a hearing about the guidelines, and that's where the witnesses came in. There weren't any witnesses during the actual sentencing hearing. What the defense really relied on were those hundreds of letters that Judge Kendall had read and already had, even quoting from some of those letters.
Yeah, and that was really remarkable. She said, I've never in all my career seen so many letters written on your behalf. Ed Burke, when he got up there, he had a short, prepared statement that he read. I can quote here one of his, the blame for this is mine and mine alone. I regret the pain and the sorrow I have caused my family and dear friends. So he expressed some regret that prosecutors said he'd never, admitted to before. I don't know that swayed the judge at this late in the game.
Right.
But, she obviously had taken into account 50 years of good, and she said those 2 years of bad cannot wipe out all that good. So that to me was a remarkable observation on her part.
All right, Craig Wall, Sarah Schulte, stay with us, of course, down there in the lobby of the courtroom. Right now, we want to bring in a law professor from IIT, Professor Richard Kling, joining us this afternoon following the sentencing of former Chicago Alderman Ed Burke. Professor Kling, can you hear us? Oh, there you are. Perfect. We can see you and hear you. First of all, your reaction to the 2-year sentence. The prosecution had asked for 10.
As Sarah Schulte had indicated, it's a lot less than the prosecutor had asked for, a lot less than many people expected. The judge had the range between 0 and 10. She chose to go much lower than the 10.
Richard, just your reaction. You have covered politics a long time in the Chicago area as well. Alderman Ed Burke is going to go to prison. If you would have said that to a lot of Chicagoans a few decades ago, I don't think any of them would have believed you.
Hard to believe, yeah.
It was before George Ryan was going to go to prison. It was before Rod Blagojevich was going to go to prison. So a lot of people wouldn't have believed anything. You're right. He was the most powerful alderman in the city of Chicago. He's had an illustrious career for 50 years, and he's going to have to do 2 years in jail.
And do you think this then, we had posed the same question to Laura Washington a little earlier, want to get your thoughts on that. What kind of message do you think this will send to the political structure here in Chicago, to the fellow aldermen, to other politicians about mixing, I guess, business, their private business, and public business?
You know, I think everybody knows it intellectually. You have to decide not to do it. You realize that if you get caught, you're going to be in trouble. You've seen that with governor after governor and other congressmen and politicians. The bottom line is they know that if they get caught, they're in trouble. But I think it's like many other people. Their thought is, I'm not going to get caught.
Going into this, Richard, when you see now $2 million and 2 years, going into today, or as we knew the sentencing was likely going to come here in the end of June, were you leaning one particular way? Does the incarceration surprise you, or the $2 million?
She didn't. Judge Kendall did not have a choice not to give him incarceration, even under the sentencing guidelines. As much as they're advisory, the bottom line is there had to be some incarceration. She certainly gave him incarceration at the lower end. I'm surprised at that, but she indicated she was gratified by hundreds and hundreds of letters and 50 years of a good career, not to be sullied by a couple things of bad.
All right, Professor Richard Kling, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. We're going to head back now to the courtroom.
Yes, Sarah and Craig really providing some firsthand accounts of what they saw and heard in the courtroom. So you heard Professor Kling talking about some of that testimony and the $2 million. Sarah, as you guys both saw that unfold, some of the reaction from the courtroom.
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things you're hearing Richard Kling talking about, and going back to what Judge Kendall was saying in her kind of wrap-up statement, she's talking about there have been so many aldermen and others who've gone to prison, so she seems skeptical about how much of a deterrent a long prison term was going to be.
Right, well, and that's always the big question here. I mean, it was one thing the defense raised, that this never really is a deterrent. You know, a conviction is a deterrent, but they don't believe the number of years in prison is really a deterrent. And how can it be a deterrent when we've seen so many people and so many politicians continue to walk through this building and get convicted?
Yeah, but the other point I think you made, there was an interesting observation, is that they never think they're going to get caught.
Right.
That's why these things continue to go on, and every person who commits these acts of corruption think they're smarter than the law. And obviously in this case, 2 years of what Ed Burke was convicted of doing, the judge says, look, I don't know that he did anything before that. There's no evidence before me to that, so she could not take any of that allegation.
Well, and the interesting things, one of the assistant U.S. attorney, Sarah Stryker, she brought up a couple things about that, he was no novice at this. Yeah. And that is something that the judge really couldn't take into account.
No evidence.
Maybe the assumption was the fact that he's been doing this for years, but that cannot be part of the way that the judge sentences.
Yeah.
One thing I thought was pretty interesting is, the one thing the defense also brought up a lot was his age. I mean, he's 80 years old. They were really concerned about his age, that this could be a life sentence for him, or a death sentence for him. And she did take that into account, his age.
I think she did, and she took into account, his health considerations. But the bottom line is she felt she had to send him to prison for at least some amount of time. And just to give him the extraordinary amount of fines that she did in this case was, because he has the means to pay it, she jacked up the fines.
And we've talked about $30 million that he's been, his net worth is, or has put away. Yeah. So I think $2 million is a little bit of a dent here, but yes, it's certainly a strong message with the amount of money.
The other thing I thought was interesting that the judge was talking about is that when there is public corruption, it erodes the people's faith in democracy and their trust in government, and that can take a long time to get that back. And so, she obviously was also weighing that, because there is a public impact when you have corruption going on like that people do lose their faith in the rule of law.
I think the biggest deterrent in this case, or the biggest deterrent moving forward, is the wire. I mean, you had a very close friend of his wear a wire, and without the wiretaps and without those recordings, there would not be a case here. And I think maybe that might be the biggest deterrent of, because you never know who's now wearing a wire. That wasn't the case years ago. You probably weren't going to get, a very good close friend wearing a wire on you, because they were all in on it too.
Yeah, and in this case, you're talking about Danny Solis.
Danny Solis,
and
correct.
The judge did bring that up because she asked the prosecutors where things stood with Danny Solis' case, and he is a cooperating witness, and so she was troubled by the fact that you're asking me to send Ed Burke to prison, but Danny Solis may never go to prison, and yet he committed so many of these similar corrupt acts. He was involved with some of them, and so she was a little bit troubled by that. I just have to think that was part of a factor in her decision to just go with the 24 months in prison. And the other fact too is the defense were. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sarah, question for you. So you, as you heard all that testimony, both of you said the judge was surprised. I mean, not surprised, but all of that positive testimony from Burke's confidants. Did any strike you as sticking out, or did former Alderman Burke react to any of that more, you think, as that went on? All this support for him in court before his sentence.
Well, the observation I can make is kind of two things. One, when the prosecution was making their case and talking about all the crimes that he committed and all this, I could see this, what seemed to me, this is just an observation, kind of a worried look on Ann Burke's face. Ed Burke was stoic really throughout. I mean, he has a really deep frown, and that was on his face an awful lot. But her demeanor seemed to change a little bit when the defense was making its case, when the defense was reading from all of these letters.
Right. His did too. It was, even though he still had that frown on his face, I could tell his face was a little bit more engaged,
Encouraged,
a
perhaps.
little bit, right.
What was going before the judge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But those letters, I mean, there were hundreds of them, really did make a difference in this. I believe they did.
Absolutely. Yep. Back to you guys.
And Craig, can you just walk us through one more time the details? I believe you said there is a prison reporting date in September. Is that what you said earlier?
Yes, let me get it down to my September 23rd is the date he has to surrender.
Okay.
The defense has requested the federal correctional camp in Oxford, Wisconsin.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Craig and Sarah, terrific work out there. Our team coverage is going to continue on ABC 7 after Final Jeopardy, so we'll see you in just a few minutes.
This has been an ABC 7 Eyewitness News special report.